very welcome news that pubs such as the Friends of Haddon Cross are benefiting from the measures we've taken in this regard.
Ski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend actually join me on a pub crawl in Shrewsbury?
Say yes. You know you want to, Chancellor.
I'm buying.
Oh, yeah.
We're all going.
He's mentioned some very positive figures about government support to pubs, but I would like him to come to the Salopian Bar, my local in Shrewsbury, to hear at first hand the extraordinary rises in business rates that some of these pubs have had to deal with. I would like him to get a first-hand experience by talking to these landlords about some of the financial pressures they're under.
Well, Mr. Speaker, provided I can get it in writing that he is buying, I'm very tempted to consider that offer, and I'll negotiate with him. Look, I understand the pressure that pubs and many traditional businesses are facing. Pubs in Shrewsbury have benefited from recent cuts to alcohol duties and business rates, but of course we recognise the challenge that many smaller businesses are facing, and we will keep that challenge very much in mind as we formulate policies going forward.
Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, he's obviously very welcome on a pub crawl around Darlington too, and I always stand my round. The issue, many of us that represent towns are fighting very hard to support our high streets, and the pressures that have confronted retail with business rates are exactly the same when it comes to pubs and catering outlets. In my town, there are so many anomalies when it comes to pubs and business rates that it's almost normal to be an anomaly. This situation needs urgently looking at, and will he investigate the way in which smaller pubs are particularly disadvantaged by the business rate system?
It is true that pubs are assessed in a different way from other retail premises for business rates, and we have looked at this recently and concluded that the current system was in fact the best system for pubs, but I'm very happy to look again at it. I'd say to the honourable lady that we all recognise, every single one of us, whatever part of the country we represent, that high streets are under pressure. And that's primarily because the behaviour of consumers is changing. And I think our challenge is to support the high street as it goes through that change process. We can't simply turn our backs on a change which is driven by consumer behaviour, but we do have to support businesses as they make it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Chancellor would agree that there is a need to encourage entrepreneurs and small businesses, start-ups, including setting up new pubs. So would he agree to follow the Welsh Labour Government's lead, who have set up a micro-small business fund that provides up to £500,000 a year to set up small businesses, to protect jobs and create them, so that this could be something that could be done UK-wide that could protect lots of small industries, including the pub industry?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that we do have the Start-up Loan Scheme, which provides support for entrepreneurs starting small businesses, and the government will continue to encourage small businesses to be established and then to grow.
Mohammed Yassin.
Mr. Speaker.
The Chief Secretary of the Treasury.
Mr. Speaker, we have regular meetings with the Health Secretary, and we've recently allocated an additional fund of 3.4% rise per year to the National Health Service, which will equate to £20 billion by 2023.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bedfordshire, children with mental health issues are travelling up to 100 miles to access services. Their recovery is hugely compromised by sending them away from their families and friends. Will he now commit funds to local specialist facilities for young people and reinstate the mental health beds in Bedford that his government took away?
We recognise that there is increasing demand for the NHS, which is precisely why we've allocated the additional funding, and shortly the Health Secretary will be publishing a 10-year plan which will have mental health as one strand of it.
The Desmond Swain.
Is it reasonable for me to expect to pass my assets and property to my heirs unencumbered and intact, and at the same time to expect the taxpayer to pay for my social care?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. Of course, social care is an area we do recognise where reform is needed, and my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will shortly be publishing a green paper to outline some of the options and to make sure we have a proper discussion as a country about the future of social care.
George.
Thank you very much. My own CCG in North Derbyshire has seen an uplift of only 1% over the 5-year funding settlement from 2016-2017, resulting in a deficit of £51 million this year to find of cuts and £71 million next year. They're having to cut everything that is not statutorily needed to provide, including all voluntary services. Will the Chancellor look at the funding that has gone to the National Health Service over the past 6 years to make sure it can be met?
Well, no doubt the Honourable Lady will welcome the additional money that has been allocated to the NHS to reflect this increasing demand. And I'd point out that under the plans supported by the party opposite, which would mean fewer businesses, fewer jobs and less tax revenue, there'd be less money going into the NHS and going into her local services.
Stern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is strong public appetite not only for increased spending on the NHS, but also education, defence and a whole host of other areas. And if the polls and all of the petitions are to believe, a strong public appetite to pay more tax in order to finance those. Can the Minister bear that in mind in the upcoming budget?
Well, I'm sure my honourable friend will recognise that we are not going to announce the contents of the budget at today's Treasury questions. But what I would point out is we are a government that believes in low taxes. We've reduced taxes on basic rate taxpayers by £1,000. And of course, as well as putting that extra money into the NHS, my job as Chief Secretary is to make sure we get value for money for every penny we spend. And that's why we're developing a 10-year plan, we're improving the use of technology, and we're getting better value for money for the drugs budget as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Chief Secretary aware, in the discussions that the Health Secretary may have had on NHS funding, whether he mentioned his unilateral plan to ditch the 2013 pensions deal agreed with representative bodies, which was supposed to last for 25 years and which may affect 1 million NHS staff?
Well, what I am aware of, Mr. Speaker, is the deal that has been done with NHS workers to give them a 6.5% pay rise in exchange for reform over the next 3 years. What we know is that, on average, public sector workers get approximately 10% more in terms of pensions than their private sector counterparts. But we're also making sure we've got the right wages to recruit and retain people in the NHS.
Peter Dow.
Clearly, the Chief Secretary doesn't even know what she put out in her name. The pension changes snuck out on Thursday evening could negatively affect the pensions of a further £4 million public sector workers. No, it's not the case. So I ask on behalf of those dedicated public sector workers, nurses, doctors, social workers, teachers, support staff, refuse collectors, will the Chancellor withdraw these snidey proposals and honour his predecessor's deal? Is that too much to ask? Or will millions of staff in the public sector be let down and betrayed yet again by this government?
Mr. Speaker, I think the party opposite has misunderstood the announcement we made last week, which is actually making sure that more money goes into public sector pensions in line with the deal that we did with the unions previously.
Danielle Rowley.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker.
Minister John Glenn.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer this question alongside number 7. The government is taking a proactive approach to support borrowers, enabling them to manage their money well and help those in problem debt. We reformed the consumer credit regulation in 2014, and I'm now working on setting up the single financial guidance body to help those who are in difficulties.
Danielle Rowley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 8 workers are living in poverty. The average worker is earning £25 less per week than 10 years ago. Many of my constituents who are working all the hours they can find, Mr Speaker, still have to come to my office for food bank referrals and for debt advice. So will the Minister accept that this rhetoric is absolutely talking down people who are working as much as they can but still living in poverty?
No, I'm sorry, I wouldn't accept that. I would accept that this government is committed to doing all it can for hard-working people. That's why we've raised the national living wage, which means £600 for those working full-time, and I'm sure she'd want to welcome the Wage Data Act today.
Matthew Pennycook.
According to the Money Advice Service, the proportion of people in Greenwich and Woolwich who are over-indebted is higher than both the UK and London averages. And I know from my advice surgery that a significant amount of this is down to the behaviour of rip-off lenders. What more will the government do to clamp down on predatory lending?
Well, the primary responsibility for rogue lending lies with the FCA. Their report at the end of May brought in a number of measures, a cap on rent-to-own, but I accept that more can be done, and that's why I'm working very hard with my colleague in DWP on the Financial Inclusion Forum to look at the expansion of alternative, affordable forms of credit for the poorest in our society.
Mr. Speaker, can I urge the Minister to take firm action against people who exploit the most vulnerable in our society, particularly loan sharks, whether they be payday lenders, rent-to-own outfits like Bright House, rip-off bank overdraft fees, or indeed exploitative doorstep lending? Can he be firm to make sure we protect the most vulnerable?
I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that assurance. I have deep conversations with the FCA regularly on this matter, but I also I've met with Scott Cash and credit unions over the recess to see what alternative supplies of affordable credit are available.
Under the party opposite, household debt rose every year bar one, yet the Office for National Statistics shows that since 2010 the number of children in workless households has fallen by a staggering 637,000. Doesn't that demonstrate a huge contrast in the economic achievements of this government compared to the track record of the party opposite?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for reminding us of those facts, and I was also looking that during the duration of the Labour government there was an increase in the welfare budget of 65% or 84 billion in real terms. We have to spend money wisely, and the honourable gentleman's observations are welcome.
Vincent Cable.
British families are currently spending considerably more than their disposable income. And as a consequence, debt levels in relation to income are rising back to crisis levels. At the same time, France and Germany have big savings surpluses. Which is the most sustainable of the two options?
I think what is sustainable is that real household disposable income is up by 4.6% since 2010. But I acknowledge that there are those who are experiencing challenges, and that's why I've set out the measures that the government's taking and we're determined to take to assist those who are in a vulnerable position.
Isn't the way to combat poverty and create prosperity creating jobs and raising wages? And in that context, isn't it welcome that a combination of the massive increase in the minimum wage and the increase in the personal allowance since 2010 have increased the net wages of someone working on the minimum wage by 39% when CPI during that period has been only 19%?
Well, as always, the honourable gentleman is on top of the figures and sets out very clearly the positive story that this government has to tell. But as I say, there's no room for complacency. This government is committed to getting as many people back into work, and we welcome the record figures that exist at the moment.
Mr Speaker, Kingston upon Hull has the third highest levels of household debt in England and Wales, whilst Kingston upon Thames has the second lowest. Why does the Minister think that is, and what's he going to do about it?
Well, across the country there are different profiles of debt, and that's why the government is committed to making interventions through the Financial Inclusion Forum to expand affordable credit and assist those who are in difficulty. There is no room for complacency, and the government is committed to assisting where necessary.
Does the Minister share my view that one of the best ways of helping hard-working families is enabling them to keep more of the money that they earn by keeping taxes low? And will he commit to this government continuing to keeping taxes as low as possible for working people?
Absolutely we will.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government may say that it's taking action on household debt, but the fact is it relies on that excessive debt for economic growth. The OBR says that 9/10 of all GDP growth last year was attributable to household consumption, and that is being fuelled, as we've heard, by unsustainable levels of debt. What we have to do instead is to raise investment, both public and private, which in the UK is well below the average for developed countries. We've got plans to do that, but will we see any proposals from the government to do that in the forthcoming budget?
Well, the Chancellor has set out in successive budgets our commitment to invest in this economy with the National Productivity Plan. I think what we do need to recognise, though, is that we need to have affordable investment. And I think what we've found out over the last 24 hours is that the plans of the members opposite are in confusion. If £500 billion is just a down payment and the start of investment, where will it end, and is it affordable?
Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, let's have some facts.
Indeed.
By 2021, the OBR predicts that unsecured household debt will reach 47% of income. The last peak was 45% in 2007. It is the case that families are using credit to pay for essential items. It is the case that those people who are going to food banks are often in work because work is not paying.
Here.
What is the Treasury going to do? Is it going to admit that austerity has created this mess?
I think what the government is doing is creating the conditions for growth, raising the national living wage. And when I visited Glasgow just a few weeks ago, it was encouraging to see the constructive way that the First Class Credit Union and Sharon McPherson of Scott Cash was working with the poorest to help them when they're in difficulty.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really pleased that the Chancellor said he's going to consider visiting a local pub. Is he going to consider coming to Seafine, which is a food bank in my constituency? They've today made a call for more food because their shelves are empty. If he was to come and visit a food bank like Seafine, he would find out first-hand the effect that Tory UK government policies are having on individuals up and down the country. He cannot stand there and say that employment is up when the reality is that people are poorer than ever.
Well, I'll take no lectures from the Honourable Lady about food banks. Trussell Trust Food Banks was founded in my constituency, and I have a dialogue with them. They have done a great deal to assist many people up and down this country, and I'm proud of the work that they do.
Ben Bradley. Sir Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, over the course of this Parliament, long-term investment in our infrastructure will reach levels not sustained since the 1970s. In the East Midlands, for example, we're investing from the National Productivity Investment Fund to reduce congestion. We're investing £125 million this year on local road maintenance, and we announced this summer £780 million for a series of works to upgrade the East Coast Main Line.
Bradley.
As my near neighbour in Nottinghamshire, I know the Minister will be aware of the Robin Hood line that runs through my constituency from Nottingham, and proposals that have appeared in various budgets now to extend it across Warsop in the north of my constituency. The Transport Secretary has ensured that the new franchisee will have to consider the business case for this extension. Can the Minister confirm that the Treasury will support it financially if that business case comes forward?
Well, I know that my honourable friend and the member for Sherwood have been campaigning on this for several years, and we recognise its potential to unlock economic opportunities in Mansfield and Ollerton within the East Midlands franchise. We have included a requirement that the operator should come to the Secretary of State for Transport within 1 year with a business case for extending passenger services to his communities, and the Department for Transport and the Treasury will consider that very carefully.
Chris Leslie.
Does the Minister accept that it was crucial investment from the European Investment Bank and the European Regional Development Fund that recently underpinned the Midlands Engine Investment Fund, and that a hard Brexit risks pulling the rug from underneath many critical investment projects? He knows in his heart that a cake-and-eat-it Brexit is a pure illusion, and that his ERG colleagues still can't explain how it would work. Wouldn't it be better if we just let the public sort this out and have a say with a people's vote?
Well, the public have already had a say, and in the East Midlands, where we're discussing, the public were very clear that they wanted to leave the European Union. And with respect to infrastructure investments, which are substantially higher over the course of this Parliament than they were under the last Labour government, 25% higher in the East Midlands, 40% higher in Yorkshire and the Humber, the primary reason for that is the responsible management of the public finances by this government.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Will my honourable friend take time to point out where some of this infrastructure spend is going? At the moment, Derby Station is being remodelled, 200 million. The M1 is being upgraded to smart motorways. This is massive investment for the long-term future of the East Midlands.
Right honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course he was the Secretary of State that led many of these important investments. In the East Midlands, we are investing in the smart motorway, we're investing in the upgrade on the East Coast Main Line, we're investing in Derby Bus Station, in new green buses in Nottingham. The list continues, and only because of this government's management of the public finances and keeping the economy growing.
No. Bishop Auckland and Helion and Yar are both admirable places, but last time I looked, neither of them was situated in the East Midlands, to which this question is devoted. Mr. Gary Streeter.
Mr. Speaker, question number 6, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we recognise that the Mayflower commemorations are an important moment for this country to celebrate our tied history with the United States and the unending quest for religious freedom and toleration. In the 2015 spending review, the government gave £500,000 to the Mayflower 400 project, and will continue to support it in the years to come.
Mr. Gary Streeter.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Minister for the response, but given the significance of the voyage of the Mayflower in historical terms, one of the most influential journeys on the whole planet, helping to fund our democracy and freedom, will the Minister respond positively to the letter he's had from the APPG for the Mayflower, requesting that we have sufficient resources to celebrate this amazing event in a spectacular fashion?
Well, we've, at his suggestion, and that of the member for Plymouth Moor View, I met with Charles Hackett, the Chief Executive of the Mayflower 400 project. We had a productive meeting, and we're considering the materials that they left with us. I'd advise him and the organisers of Mayflower 400 to continue to work with the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport and the Treasury as they continue to formulate their plans that will benefit not just Plymouth, but Boston, Bassetlaw and communities across the country.
The edification of those observing our proceedings, I can advise that the Honourable Gentleman Member for Huddersfield has just been chuntering at me that his grandmother had a link with the Mayflower, about which I think we are to be enlightened. Mr. Barry Shearman.
He was on it. Pilgrim.
Some members of the House may have thought that I was on the Mayflower. Although I did later, as a young man, emigrate to the United States. But could we use this very important? Some of my ancestors, the Shermans, could have been on the Mayflower. But the fact of the matter is, just hold it for a moment. Could we use this anniversary, 400 years? Isn't it the time that we could celebrate migration? The fact that the talent, the genius, the innovation, the ideas that we get in this country from migration, America got from migration. Isn't it time for the use this quadricentenary to celebrate migration across the world?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is testing my knowledge of the Pilgrim Fathers, but of course they were inspired by William Bradford, who came from Yorkshire, I believe, and he was the one who said that from small things, great things can emerge, and it takes just one small candle to light 1,000, which was the way that the whole Pilgrim Fathers enterprise was summed up. So I want to see the commemorations take place in Yorkshire as well as in Plymouth and the rest of the country.
Because...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I urge the Minister not to forget Immingham in my constituency, which also played a major part in where the Pilgrim Fathers sailed from? And would he ensure that Immingham is a major player in any celebrations?
Well, I have tried to list all the places where the Pilgrim Fathers came from, but I wasn't aware that some came from Immingham as well. But I'm sure that will be included in the celebrations.
Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Discussion of DCMS support for the Mayflower raises, of course, the problem that DCMS regional funding is deeply unfair, with far more in London. And indeed, this is the pattern on infrastructure, which the Minister was talking about before. So to what extent does the Minister believe that it's unfair patterns of government spending that are the cause of the fact that household income in the North East is only £15,000 per year, whereas in London it's £27,000?
Yes. Well, as the Honourable Lady will be aware, the Arts Council has a formula to distribute funding across the country. We believe, like she does, that it's important that all communities in this country can have access to culture and to heritage. It's for that reason and others that we funded the Great Exhibition of the North, which has been a huge success, and of course which the Chancellor 2 years ago in his budget supported the huge economic opportunity and cultural of restoring Wentworth Woodhouse near to the Honourable Lady's constituency.
Number 8, Mr.
Mr. Speaker, guidance on contracting out public services is set by the Cabinet Office, and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, has reviewed the guidance thoroughly.
Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appropriate transitions from prisons to the community are central in successfully reintegrating prisoners back into society and bringing down reoffending rates. Yet it is my understanding that some prisoners are being prevented from moving from Category C to Category D as they near their release date. Could the Minister confirm if this is indeed the case and whether this is just another example of ineffective cost-saving measures?
Well, my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, has recently released a strategy all about how we are going to get more offenders into employment. We've got a cross-government working group on that to make sure that people make the appropriate transition. But I do suggest that she speaks to the Justice Department to get further details.
Mr. Speaker, to support British households, the Government has frozen fuel duty for 8 successive years. By April 2019, these freezes will have saved the average car driver £850 compared to the pre-2010 escalator, and the average van driver over £2,100. But it is important that we remember the other side of this coin. The fuel duty freezes since 2011 have meant the Exchequer has foregone around £46 billion in revenues through to 2018-19, and a further £38 billion will be foregone over the budget forecast period as a result of these previously announced freezes. For context, this is about twice as much as we spend on all NHS nurses and doctors each year.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Treasury study in 2014 said that freezing fuel duty benefits the economy to offset almost all the loss of tax to the economy, and it said that GDP would increase by 4.5 to 7.5 billion over the forthcoming years. Given the recent rise in petrol by 13p and diesel by 15p over the past year, does he agree with his own Treasury report that maintaining the fuel duty freeze would benefit the economy and help hard-working people in our country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the analysis that my honourable friend refers to is from 2014, and obviously that analysis would have to be looked at again in the context of the economy today. But I do understand that the rise in oil prices and the feed-through that has had to the pump does represent a very real pressure for motorists, which, of course, we will take into account.
Know that the freeze on fuel duty is only a sticking plaster, it can't go on forever. One way of cutting down on emissions is electric cars. However, in my constituency there's not a single electric car charging point. Will he now commit to invest in more electrical charging points across the country?
Well, I don't know about forever, but it's gone on for 8 years, as I've just explained to the House. But the honourable gentleman is right. Of course, the car fleet has to electrify if we're going to meet our carbon emissions targets. And we set up a £400 million fund in the last budget to support the rollout of electric charging infrastructure, which is clearly critical for that to happen.
Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, one of the other major impacts on the wages of the lowest paid is the national living wage. And does my right honourable friend agree that it's our reforms on this side of the House that have boosted the incomes of the lowest paid significantly?
Mr. Speaker, and what we have sought to do, despite the very, very difficult fiscal circumstances, is both address drivers of cost for households, such as freezing fuel duty, freezing alcohol duty, and, on the other side of the equation, reduce the tax that people are paying on their wages and raise the earning of those on the lowest wages by introducing and then increasing the national living wage.
Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the freeze on fuel duty, diesel is currently at $1.33 per litre. Rural communities in particular are finding it very, very difficult. Can the Chancellor give some indication of what help he can give to rural communities who are dependent on their vehicles to get to work and to have a life?
Well, Mr. Speaker, many people are dependent on vehicles both for everyday living and for work, and we understand, as I've already said, the pressure that higher oil prices and their feed through to the pumps presents for individual consumers. And of course we take all these matters into account when setting future policy.
Order. I hope the House will join me in welcoming back from her maternity leave the honourable member for East Dunbartonshire, Jo Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 10.
Financial Secretary of the Treasury, Mel Stride.
You're welcome to the Right Honourable Lady. Good to see her in her place. It is absolutely right that all companies in this country should pay a fair rate of tax. The government recognises that there are some businesses, typically online companies, for whom the current international tax regime is not entirely appropriate. We are working with the OECD and the European Union on finding a solution to that, and we have made it clear that in the event that we do not reach a situation where we can move multilaterally, then we will take unilateral action.
Swinson.
I thank the Minister for that answer, and indeed the fact that Amazon's UK profits trebled yet they ended up paying less tax shows how that tax model is broken for large international tech companies. The Minister says the UK may act unilaterally if that international progress is not made at sufficient pace, but with the OECD report not expected until 2020, is he prepared to wait that long before starting to act, or does he anticipate perhaps joining in with our European Union allies on the 3% interim revenue tax before then?
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only are we working with the European Union, but we are also obviously closely working with the OECD, and at our persuasion, indeed, they have recently decided that they will bring forward that report to 2019, so we are making progress at the multilateral level, but as I have clearly stated, Mr. Speaker, we should all be in no doubt that we are prepared to take unilateral action should that be appropriate.
Stephen Crabb.
The question is whether there's a level playing field. So when my right honourable friend hears, for example, that bookshops pay around 11 times more total tax than Amazon on the same £100 of turnover, does he think that we're striking the right balance to enable our town centres and our communities to thrive?
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to business rates, which of course is the heart of the taxes to which my right honourable friend refers, we have done a great deal since 2016. We will, by 2023, provide reliefs totalling some £10 billion in respect of business rates, much of which will fall as relief to the High Street. But I do take on board the comments that my right honourable friend has made, and of course, as with all taxes, we will keep these under review.
Annalisa Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to the comments by the Financial Secretary, frequently international coordination on tax has actually been blocked by this government. We saw that particularly when it came to the taxation of trusts, where it's both David Cameron and now the current government that has argued against more tax transparency. It's no surprise that as a result, experts like the Director of Fidelity International are saying that the Amazon case shows how tax policy hasn't moved on. Why is this government letting giant multinationals get away with it and letting everybody else down? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be extremely clear to the House. This government has an exemplary record on clamping down on avoidance, evasion and non-compliance. We have one of the lowest tax gaps in the entire world at 5.7%, far lower than was the case under the party opposite. We have brought in a number of rules under the BEPS project, which we were in the vanguard of that particular project. For example, on tax deductions for interest expense that came in 2016, yielding £3.9 billion by 2021. And, of course, the diverted profits tax that we brought in 2015 that has already raised some £700 million.
And Russell Moyle.
Number 11.
Mr. Speaker, we have brought in a number of incentives to encourage employee share ownership, not least employee ownership trusts, which provide a capital gains tax advantage to those businesses selling shares into the trust, and tax advantages to employees alike. We have also brought in the enterprise management incentives, company share option plan, save as you earn, and the share incentives plan as well.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Small and medium-sized businesses are the lifeblood of local communities' economies. But with 60% of small businesses with no succession plan after their founders retire, what is the government doing to ensure that employee ownership is one of the options going forward to keep businesses going?
Speaker, I've set out a number of the schemes that the government is moving forward with, and of course this has been with great success. So in 2016-17, some 3 million employees entered into SIP share arrangements, 400,000 entered into arrangements under Save As You Earn, with an average value of shareholding of some £5,000, and there were 3,500 employees who were offered EMI incentive schemes in that particular year.
Imran Hussain.
Chancellor. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with question number 13. Today's data shows regular wages growing at the fastest rate for 3 years. The OBR forecasts that wages will continue to grow, reaching 3.5% by 2021, while CPI inflation will continue to fall, reaching the target of 2% by the end of this year. That is welcome news for everybody. Nevertheless, the government recognises the pressure on household budgets. That's why we introduced the national living wage, delivering a 7% pay rise in real terms for the lowest paid from April 2015 to April 2017. It's why we raised income tax thresholds, saving the average taxpayer over £1,000 this year, and at the last budget froze fuel and alcohol duties for a further year.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, under the current business rate system, city centre-based businesses are paying more in rates than large out-of-town-based warehouses, severely restricting the amount they can put towards wages and hampering wage growth for employees. So will the Chancellor today commit to reforming this outdated business rate system so that businesses are able to pay their staff higher wages whilst boosting our high street economy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already acknowledged the pressure that the High Street is under, and it's certainly something that the government is extremely concerned about. I do not think we can hold back the tide of changing consumer behaviour, but it's certainly right that we seek to facilitate high streets as they evolve. I remember, Mr. Speaker, when I came into this House 21 years ago, there was a similar angst among our electorates at that time about the growth of out-of-town supermarkets and the impact that was having on high streets. High streets evolved and survived and in many cases prospered. Now they're facing another challenge, and we must help them again to rise to that challenge.
Bromfield.
Sheffield City Region has the lowest hourly pay of any city region at £1.15 below the national average. A real living wage, action on zero-hours contracts and tougher labour market regulation would transform the lives of hard-pressed working people across South Yorkshire. When will the government recognise that and do something?
Mr. Speaker, I say to the honourable gentleman that he needs to look a little deeper. The real answer to low wages is improving productivity. And the challenge for this government, the challenge for any government in this country, is to work with industry, with trade unions, with training institutions to ensure that we address our productivity challenge. That means investment in infrastructure, it means investment in skills, it means support for businesses to improve management, it means access to capital for growing businesses, because only when business is growing and successful and productive can it pay the higher wages that we all want to see.
Nicky Morgan.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Now, of course, one of the people most interested in the trends in wage growth and inflation, and who gives the Treasury Select Committee evidence about that, is the Governor of the Bank of England. Can my right honourable friend indicate to the House when he expects to be able to let us know about the discussions he's been having with the current holder of that post about extending his position?
Not least because he will have important views about wage growth and inflation.
Indeed. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that he does have such views. And since my right honourable friend asked me, and I know that her committee questioned the Governor on this subject last week, I can now announce to the House that I have been discussing with the Governor his ability to be able to serve a little longer in post in order to ensure continuity through what could be quite a turbulent period for our economy in the early summer of 2019. And I can tell the House today that the Governor has agreed, despite various personal pressures to conclude his term in June, that he will continue until the end of January 2020 in order to help support continuity in our economy during this period.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Chancellor please confirm that over recent years the income of the lowest paid has grown by over twice as fast as the income of the very highest?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thanks to this government's introduction of the national living wage.
Rebecca Powell.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Green finance is a key government priority. The Chancellor recently announced the creation of a new Green Finance Institute to ensure our world-leading green finance expertise is available to UK and international firms. This was the first recommendation of the Green Finance Task Force, and further responses from government will come in due course.
I commend my right honourable friend for the action they've already taken in this area, but does my right honourable friend agree with me that we should encourage green investment to support new technologies, especially in the energy sector, to help develop devices that can bring down household bills, make us more efficient, waste less energy and cut down on our greenhouse emissions? It's the subject of my 10-minute rule bill tomorrow, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I agree with the Honourable Lady. It is absolutely the case that through the supply of smart meters, every household and small business will have those advantages by 2020. And according to data from a leading energy supplier, we're already seeing energy efficiency savings of around 4% on annual consumption.
You'll know from the UN that by 2050 there'll be more plastic in the sea than fish. So will he ensure the Chancellor brings forward a budget which has got a comprehensive fiscal strategy that ensures that plastic producers pay 100% for the recycling and targets tax at plastic according to its recyclability?
Well, we're very interested in that area, and we've published a response to the call for evidence, and I'm sure the Chancellor will have heard the honourable gentleman's representations.
Respond positively to the Environmental Audit Committee's report on green finance, in particular encouraging investment institutions such as pension funds to consider the long-term risks that climate change may pose to their investee companies.
Absolutely, and just 2 hours ago the Department of Work and Pensions published its consultation response on pension trustees' duties, and this clearly sets out the government's intention to raise the profile of financially material climate change factors in investment decisions.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will be more than aware of the Ernst & Young report earlier this year, indicating that Scottish GDP, including Scotland's geographical share of renewable energy, oil and gas, grew at 3.4% as opposed to the UK's 3.1%, despite lots of inaction from the current government. Will the government provide Holyrood with the powers over energy revenues to ensure Scotland can continue with this lead in economic growth and make sure that the green energies of the future are invested in properly?
Well, absolutely, green energy is very important to the UK economy as a whole. It's just very unfortunate that the rate of growth in the Scottish economy is half as strong as the rest of the United Kingdom.
Order. Topical question. Stephen Metcalfe.
No, sorry, number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, my principal responsibility is to ensure economic stability and the continued prosperity of the British people, both during this period of heightened uncertainty and beyond it after Brexit. And I will do so by building on the plans that I set out in the autumn budget and the spring statement. This government will continue to take a balanced approach to the public finances that enables us to give households, businesses and our public services targeted support in the near term, as well as investing in the future of this country and getting debt down to cut interest costs and deliver fairness to the next generation.
Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Essex has the potential to play a huge part in delivering on those aspirations, as I and some of my Essex colleagues saw last Friday as we took a clipper journey from Purfleet out to Southend and back. It was an extraordinary experience. Can I therefore invite the Chancellor to come and join us and see the part that South Essex can play in making Britain great again?
Well, I think it's back to the same point, Mr. Speaker. It depends if he's buying.
John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are only weeks to go now before a deal has to be agreed with our European partners, but there are still mixed messages coming from government ministers. The Foreign Secretary says that crashing out of the EU without a deal would be, and I quote, a mistake we would regret for generations. The Brexit Secretary says no deal would bring countervailing opportunities, and the Prime Minister says it wouldn't be the end of the world. The Chancellor has a critical role to play in bringing some rationality to this debate. The Treasury has calculated that no deal could result in the UK's GDP being over 10% smaller. Will he outline and be absolutely clear to some of his colleagues today what that would mean for jobs, for wages, investment and living standards?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is no ambiguity at all about the government's objective. It wants to strike a deal with the European Union based on the white paper that we have published, which we believe will be good for Britain and good for the European Union. And we are devoting all our efforts over the coming weeks and months to securing that deal and protecting the British economy.
John McDonnell.
Well, his time is running out, and increasingly people on all sides of this issue are feeling let down. So let me put this to the Chancellor. Can we both try and get the message across to the Prime Minister, who continues to insist that no deal is better than... No deal is better than... No, a bad deal... No deal... To insist that a bad deal is better than no deal. So I'll negotiate that again, Mr. Speaker. Who continues to insist that a bad deal is better than no deal. So business organisations are clear. The CBI's warning of a catastrophe. The National Farmers Union said it would be an Armageddon scenario. And according to the TUC, a no-deal Brexit would be devastating for working people. So can I appeal to the Chancellor? He knows the consequences of no deal. Will he now show some leadership and make it clear to his colleagues that he will not accept a no-deal scenario?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd love to know what it actually said on his bit of paper. But let me be very clear to the right honourable gentleman. I, the Prime Minister, all members of the Cabinet are committed to achieving a deal which protects British jobs, protects British businesses and British prosperity going forward. That is what we are committed to. He's absolutely right that time is running out. We are working against the clock. We understand that, and we will be working flat out over the coming weeks and months to achieve that.
Scott Mann.
Mr. Speaker, the Treasury will be well aware of the passion that my residents in North Cornwall feel about the scourge of marine plastics. After the record consultation that the Treasury has received on single-use plastics, can the Chancellor say how far he's prepared to go in terms of what he's going to do in the budget?
Well, first of all, can I recognise my honourable friend's long-standing commitment to this cause and the role that his constituency, in fact, has played in first bringing to people's attention the catastrophe that's going on around plastics in our oceans. We want to be the first generation that leaves the environment in a better state than we found it, and tackling the scourge of plastic waste is a clear priority to support this, and the call for evidence, as he said, represents the level of public concern. I want to be clear that we're committed to acting to tackle plastic waste and to using tax alongside other tools to change behaviour. I'm working very closely with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, and I will bring forward further proposals in the budget.
Reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan is investing in frontline policing, but like police and crime commissioners across the country, he's swimming against the tide of deep government cuts, which is why violent crime in the last 3 years has doubled in Essex, in Cambridgeshire, in Warwickshire, in Hampshire, in Norfolk, the Tory shires. Isn't it time for the government to accept that they need to refocus, particularly in light of the damning report of the National Audit Office today? The government needs to refocus on cutting crime, not police.
We've protected the police budget in real terms since 2015. But isn't it time that the London Mayor started taking responsibility for what's happening in the city that he is meant to be leading? When it comes to Crossrail, when it comes to crime, he's not taking responsibility. He needs to stop passing the buck.
Orders. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the East of England All-Party Parliamentary Group launched their budget submission, prepared in conjunction with business and local government. Does my right honourable friend recognise the region's enormous economic potential, and will she work with us to unlock it?
Well, I was delighted to visit my honourable friend and see the booming businesses in Lowestoft, St Peter's Brewery exporting around the world, and also Baron Bygod, which has, I think, the only raw milk vending machine in the whole of the UK. We will look very closely at his submission and continue to invest in this vitally important part of the country.
Since 2010, and police forces such as mine, and it's a fact, in Cheshire have their budget slashed by a massive £56 million. Surely it's time that the National Audit Office report exposing this crisis in funding for our police service is a wake-up call to the Treasury.
We have protected police budgets in real terms since 2015. Of course, the nature of crime is changing and police forces have to adjust to that across the country. And also, we've recently announced a 2% pay rise for frontline police officers as well.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Speaker, when this government was first elected in 2010, its defining mission was to fix the deficit. Will the Chancellor update us as to what progress has been made and how that has benefited my constituents in the North West?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the government inherited the largest budget deficit since the Second World War at 9.9% of GDP. Our balanced approach to fiscal policy means that we have significantly reduced the deficit by over 4/5 to 1.9% of GDP last year. That has had benefits for all our constituencies as the economy has continued to grow. My honourable friends' constituents will have seen that benefit in the North West. More than 268,000 more people are in employment over this period, and there are 93,000 more businesses.
Mr. Speaker, anyone who attended the Unison briefing this morning would know how worried local authority workers are about the impact of austerity on the services that they provide. Can the Chancellor reassure them that they will be seeing in his next budget a level of budget that doesn't see many more authorities facing the catastrophe that Northamptonshire's had and that we've all witnessed this year?
Mr. Speaker, when the Conservatives came into government in 2010, the vast majority of money that was spent locally was raised centrally, damaging accountability. We've now switched that round and more money is being raised locally, the vast majority of it. Of course, we've given recently councils more power to raise council tax to afford growing demand for areas like social care and children's services, and we will continue to look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This summer we saw the devastation of the collapse of an elevated roadway in Italy. In Chelmsford, a main route into the city is over the Army and Navy flyover, which is now 40 years old. I'm not going to suggest that it's on the brink of an Italian disaster, but it will need replacing. What funds might be available to assist?
Well, the Honourable Lady and I met earlier in the summer to discuss the flyover, and she raised concerns then. I appreciate that it's been closed due to safety concerns over the summer. Funding is available through Essex County Council and, of course, through her local enterprise partnership, who've received almost £600 million excuse me, over a spending period.
Antonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor will be aware of Macmillan Cancer Support's long campaign to introduce a duty of care on financial service providers to ensure vulnerable customers get the support they need to stop financial problems escalating. The FCA has now published a discussion paper on the introduction of a duty of care. Will the Chancellor commit to meeting with Macmillan to discuss the consultation after it closes on the 2nd of November?
Well, it was one of the first things I did was to encourage the FCA to bring forward that paper, and I'd be very happy to meet with Macmillan Care again to discuss their concerns following its publication in July.
Paul Masterton.
Speaker, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury saw firsthand when he visited East Remshire a couple of weeks ago how small businesses are utilising fintech to become more efficient and agile. So what is the government doing to help more SMEs like First Floors and Giffnock, who he visited, understand and take advantage of the opportunities fintech presents?
Well, he's absolutely right. It was a privilege to meet David Hepburn at First Floors and see the value of new products. The government is committed to stimulating more investment in fintech, and it was a privilege to visit Fintech Scotland, who are doing a lot too. We've invested a considerable amount to increase the numbers of people who are taking the step to innovate in finance. With open banking, we will see more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to a recent written parliamentary question, the Secretary of State for International Development confirmed that she paid her department's cleaners the living wage, the London living wage. Sadly, when I asked the same question of the Treasury, the response was, Her Majesty's Treasury does not hold the information. Could the Chancellor take this opportunity to clarify why he and the front bench do not know how much the cleaners are paid who clean their desks every day, and promise to introduce the London living wage, not just to the Treasury, but every single cleaner who works in Whitehall?
Well, I imagine that the reason, Mr. Speaker, is that the provision of these services is contracted out, but I will investigate and I will write to the Honourable Lady.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor can rightly take pride in his policies resulting in South Leicestershire having one of the highest employment rates in Britain. On Friday, I'm meeting local businesses in Lutterworth. Harbour District Council, led by Councillor Neil Bannister, will be hosting a Meet Your MP with local businesses. What other positive message does the Chancellor have for local businesses in Lutterworth and South Leicestershire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in areas of the country like the one he refers to, we've seen a resurgence of the entrepreneurial spirit since the financial crisis, high levels of employment, good levels of wages. Now what we need to see is businesses being prepared to invest and innovate, to grow productivity so that we can carry on seeing wages rising to create the sustainable high-wage economy that we all want to see.
Mr. Speaker, starving the NHS of finance has led to South Tyneside Hospital being forced into an unpopular merger with Sunderland Hospital. Not only is South Tyneside Hospital losing key services, but staff are at risk of being placed into a private, wholly owned subsidiary where their terms and conditions are under threat. Cuts forcing backdoor privatisation are either a deliberate design of the government's plans for the NHS or incompetent financial management. Which one is it?
I do find it astonishing that nobody on the benches opposite is prepared to congratulate the government on the announcement of the £20 billion that we're putting into the NHS because of increasing demand.
Mr. Kevin Olin-Rake.
Speaker, the Chancellor has been an outspoken advocate of a fairer distribution of regional spending. In the light of this, has he read the letter we sent to him late in July, and would he commit to the Transport for the North strategic investment priorities in his forthcoming budget?
Well, we have read, and I know the Chancellor has, my honourable friend's letter to him. Over the course of this Parliament, we will be spending more central government funding per capita on transport in the north than in, for example, London or the South East. We will be considering carefully the business case for transport for Northern Powerhouse Rail when we receive it from Transport for the North later in the year.
Laura Smith.
Thank you,
Mr Speaker, further to the honourable members from Ilford North and Weaver Vale's points, and in light of their NAO's recent comments, that there are signs that forces are struggling to deliver effective services and that this government does not know if the police system is financially sustainable, what real reassurances can the Chancellor give me that the police forces will be given a real increase in funding so that they can cope with the growing demand?
Police forces have been given real terms protection in terms of their funding. What we are seeing is the nature of crime changing and police forces reforming to reflect that.
Mr Speaker, in Corby and East Northamptonshire we are seeing very considerable new housing growth, and it's essential that the infrastructure keeps pace. So in that vein, will my right honourable friend consider a new round of enterprise zone bidding opportunities to help support more growth and jobs?
I think I will treat my honourable friend's comments as a budget submission, Mr Speaker.
The House heard from Mr Dennis Skinner.
For the past hour, we've heard the whole of the Treasury bench spouting about this wonderful situation that they have with money to burn. Why, if that is the case, why has the Tory-controlled Derbyshire County Council, in their first decision, decided to close 20 libraries and cut the hours of every librarian in the whole of the county? What is he doing to stop it?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd suggest that the honourable gentleman either goes and has a hearing test or relies on reading Hansard after the session, because he has misheard what we have been saying today.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Region deals are an excellent example of Scotland's two governments working together to make it a better place to live and work. Can my right honourable friend outline the progress that she's had with the Scottish Government to ensure that constituencies like Angus benefit just as much as the cities?
Well, my honourable friend is right that we've seen a number of beneficial city deals in Scotland. We've devoted £1 billion to those deals. I'm delighted that we're making progress on the Tay Cities deal. I'll be visiting the Tay Cities very soon to have further discussions.
Mr Speaker, a recent Treasury Select Committee report on household finance found arrears to local authorities are growing, and there is an overzealous pursuit by bailiffs, and the likewise with some central government departments. What is the Treasury going to do to ensure that, as urgently as possible, that people are not penalised, vulnerable households are not criminalised by government?
That's right. Well, we've made several interventions already since our response in 2014 with bailiff law reform. I've spoken to the Minister in Ministry of Justice, and we continue to look carefully at this matter. But we do have arrangements through HMRC of time to pay, and the Cabinet Office has the Fairness Group as well.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As we move into a post-Brexit economy next year, with new global trading opportunities for UK economic growth, can the Chancellor update the House on his commitment to invest further in our Royal Navy, which is a vital tool to maintaining safe seas and oceans, so that our trade coming out of north-east ports and others can be sustained to underwrite economic growth?
Well, I certainly agree with the Honourable Lady that the Royal Navy is vitally important to the defence of Britain's interests around the world, and the principal way in which, in peacetime, we can project our power and military influence around the world. We are waiting for the conclusion of the modernising defence review undertaken by the Defence Secretary with the Cabinet Office. Once we receive that, we will be able to work with the Ministry of Defence to find a way forward out of the very considerable budgetary challenges that that ministry faces.
In March, the government postponed the closure of the childcare voucher scheme to new entrants to the 4th of October during parliamentary recess to come, to reflect concerns about the impact of this on low-income families in particular. With closure now imminent, what work has the government done to assess the impact on low-income families?
The issue with the current childcare voucher scheme is in place is it is only people whose employers sign up with that scheme who are eligible. Under tax-free childcare, everybody will be eligible, regardless of whether they're self-employed or working for an employer. What we wanted to have is a bit more time to transition from one scheme to another. The tax-free childcare is now up and running. We're ready to transition to that system.
Thank you. Order. I'm sorry to disappoint remaining colleagues, but we must now move on. Yes, a point of order, Mr. John McDonnell.
Mr. Speaker, whether people agree or disagree with the honourable member for Bolsover, he is actually respected across the House. And I invite the Chancellor now to apologise for his personal remarks that he made.
I must say I've never found anything wrong with the honourable member for Bolsover's hearing. I think it was an off-the-cuff remark. It probably wasn't the best chosen, but it's a matter for the Chancellor to judge whether he wants to say anything. And he's shaking his head. He's shaking his head. Fair enough. But the honourable gentleman's registered his point, and knowing the honourable member for Bolsover as I do, I very much doubt he'll lose any sleep over it. The honourable gentleman.
The only thing I would say to the Chancellor is, why doesn't he answer the question? Because it's pretty clear that he knows that the Tory County Council have played a blinder by throwing people out of work. That tells you a lot about this economy.
Thank you. Point of order. I'm sure it is a genuine point of order, not one of frustration or a Treasury question that wasn't asked. We look forward to hearing the honourable gentleman. Toby Perkins.
Thank you. I wanted to clarify and correct the record based on something I said yesterday. The House will have heard me ask the Education Secretary about Brookfield Community School in Chesterfield, which was an outstanding local authority school, forced into being an academy, and I said yesterday that it now required improvement and the governing body were being replaced. I've subsequently been told that I misinformed the House, and actually the school has been rated as inadequate with serious failings. So I wanted to come at the earliest possible opportunity to make you aware that things were even worse than what I said in terms of the Tory education policy.
Well, that's notably candid of the honourable gentleman. Certainly not, it has to be admitted, an expression of frustration, but he's put his point on the record, and I thank him for doing so. If there are no further points of order, we come now, colleagues, to the 10-minute rule motion. Lucy Powell.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make administrators and moderators of certain online forums responsible for content published on those forums, to require such administrators and moderators to remove certain content, to require platforms to publish information about such forums and for connected purposes. On the 18th of June 2017, Darren Osborne drove a van into a crowd of people gathered outside a North London mosque, killing one man and injuring 12 people. He had also been intending to murder the Leader of the Opposition and the Mayor of London. Just 1 month earlier, Osborne was a different person with no history of extreme ideology or beliefs. His ex-partner claimed he had been radicalised in just 3 weeks. The ground was laid by his mental health problems, long-term unemployment and alcohol abuse, but the catalyst was a television drama about grooming gangs in Rochdale, which, having seen it, led Osborne to spend the next 3 weeks consuming anti-Muslim extremist propaganda online, including sources from Tommy Robinson and Britain First, after which he was ready to kill innocent people. Whether it's inspiring domestic terrorism, young British people being pulled into fighting for terrorists overseas, or facilitating the resurgence of the far right, online radicalisation is a frighteningly dangerous process which we are not currently equipped to counter. Moreover, the spreading of hate, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism or misinformation, knowingly and without any accountability, is dangerous and is having a profound effect on our society. Our newspapers and broadcasters and other publishers are held to high standards, yet online groups, some of which have more power and reach than newspapers, aren't held to any standards, nor are they accountable. It's about time the law caught up. This bill is an attempt to make one step towards putting that right. It would make those who run large online forums accountable for the material they publish. which I believe will prevent these forums from being used to spread hate, disinformation and for criminal activity. It also requires and stops groups from being completely secret. Most of the examples I will use in my speech relate to forums or groups on Facebook. As the most popular social media platform, it is therefore the subject of most research and press coverage on this issue. Facebook groups range from a few members to hundreds of thousands and are run by administrators and moderators charged with upholding Facebook's community standards. There are groups set up to help old school or university friends keep in touch and for people with a common hobby or interest to come together for the first time. But there are also numerous examples of these forums being used for utterly appalling ends, and deliberately so. One such group is the Young Rights Society, run by a Breitbart journalist and uncovered by Hope Not Hate. The charity revealed the group was frequently awash with appalling racism, white supremacy, jokes about the Holocaust, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It was also used to organise members for events. Because it was set to secret, it was only exposed when one member alerted the charity to its existence. It's not only racism that's allowed to thrive on these forums. Marines United was a secret group of 50,000 current or ex-servicemen from the US and British militaries. Members used the forum to share nude photos of their fellow service women, described by a whistleblower as revenge porn, creepy stalker-like photos taken of girls in public, talk about rape and racist comments. That it was allowed to grow to a membership of tens of thousands before anyone thought something had to be done demonstrates the need for greater transparency. Research by Professor Jen Goldbeck of the University of Maryland shows that members of online forums feel at risk of becoming a social pariah in closed groups if they report objectionable posts, and so they don't. It's the format of these forums that makes their members become normalised to their content. People will receive far more likes for a post to a group, which will be seen by a far wider audience than posting something about their personal life on their own page. But any posts which go against the grain will result in harsh criticism and potential exclusion from the group. This can have a profound effect on society's attitudes on a number of issues. Many of the people in these forums won't have joined because they agree with its most extreme content. But if you're regularly reading posts espousing unacceptable or wrong content which is going unchecked, it can alter your own perceptions. And there are already several examples of these forums having troubling effects in the real world. Canada's largest far-right organisation started as a Facebook group on which Islamophobic conspiracies were circulated. The claimed Islamification of Canada was criticised and members were encouraged to send pigs' heads and blood to mosques, plans which were then carried out. The most disturbing example I've come across has been a forum of 8,000 parents of autistic children here in Britain. It's the sort of Facebook group might make of how people can bring people together in a difficult situation to share their experiences, but it was being used in a truly horrific way. Members told the groups that giving their children so-called bleach enemas would cure their autism. Several parents carried them out and then shared images of what they believed to be parasites, which were in fact the children's bowel linings, leaving their children after the process. The group's secret setting Autistic Society were locked out until one member contacted the police. One thing we do know is that social media companies cannot be relied upon to monitor and regulate these forums themselves. They've proven this time and time again. The Russian Internet Research Agency's action in the lead-up to the 2016 US presidential elections show how these forums are an open door to our democracies. Our political parties are also struggling with the phenomenon too. Abusive and hateful views and misinformation about politics or politicians can quickly take hold unchallenged, and unacceptable views become normalised, such as anti-Semitism or violence as an appropriate political tactic. What I'm not talking about here is censorship or small private gatherings, but accountability for powerful and large-scale publishing and sharing. Social media can be a wonderful thing which brings people together who may otherwise never have met. There is no reason why that can't be maintained, while at the same time regulating the space to prevent its abuse. So far, we've largely left the online world as a lawless Wild West. If 1,000+ people met in a town hall inciting violence towards a political opponent, or racism or hate, we would know about it and we would deal with it. The same is not said of the online world. Figures from the House of Commons Library showed that in 2007, 498 people were convicted under the Communications Act of 2003 for sending grossly offensive messages. After a decade in which social media has become a prominent part of most people's lives, this figure has nearly tripled. However, the Act they were convicted under was passed in 2003, before Facebook even existed. Stalking and harassment represent 60% of online crime overall. However, despite the increase, online hate crimes are still rarely prosecuted and largely go unreported. Our laws desperately need to catch up. Today, I'm proposing a small step, establishing clear accountability in law for what's published on online forums, forcing those who run the forums to no longer permit hate, disinformation and criminal activity. I commend this bill to the House.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Nicky Morgan, Robert Halfon, Robert Neal, Mr David Lammy, Anna Soubry, Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg, Ruth Smeeth, Luciana Berger, Stella Creasy, Jess Phillips and myself, sir. Not by each other.
Lucy Powell.
Online Forums Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 26th of October.
Friday the 26th of October. Thank you. Order. We come now to the emergency debate under Standing Order number 24. Mr Stephen Twigg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered the recent escalation of violence in Yemen. Can I start, Mr Speaker, by thanking you for granting this urgent debate under Standing Order 24. With the United Nations Human Rights Council and General Assembly this month, we are approaching what could be a pivotal moment in the Yemen conflict. I'm extremely grateful to colleagues from all parties who supported my application yesterday, and I'm pleased that the House has this opportunity to consider the ongoing conflict in Yemen before we go into the conference recess. This has been an ugly conflict, with all warring parties committing atrocities. The Houthi attack on Riyadh's main international airport last year was described by Human Rights Watch as most likely a war crime, while there have been widely documented civilian deaths attributed to the Saudi-led coalition. The Houthis have been accused of indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, besieging the city of Taiz and using wide area effect munitions in built-up parts of Yemen. If these are confirmed, they are acts that would constitute violations of international humanitarian law. Our aim, surely, Mr Speaker, must be to ensure the protection of civilians, humanitarian workers and supplies, as well as working through diplomacy to bring all the parties together around the table to negotiate peace. August was tragically one of the most violent months so far in this conflict. In the first 9 days of August alone, it is estimated that over 450 civilians lost their lives, including 131 children. 9 days, 131 children. 3 events in particular stand out. The coalition attack on August the 2nd on a market and hospital, which killed 55 and injured 130. A week later, on August the 9th, a school bus full of children hit by a coalition airstrike, killing 40 children, leaving 56 injured. And then on August the 23rd, at least 22 children were killed trying to escape the fighting in the port town of Hodeidah. Abdul's son was one of those who died in the August the 9th school bus attack. The bus, he says, was returning from a picnic. As Abdul searched through the wreckage of the bus to find the remnants of his son, he broke down and said, "I didn't find any of his remains, not his finger, not his bone, not his skull, nothing. The parents of those killed cannot even hold a proper funeral because of security concerns." This is the horrifying reality for the people of Yemen, with families losing their children every day. Now, to my knowledge, the British government has not condemned these August attacks. A statement by DFID and the Foreign Office earlier this month expressed serious concern and welcomed the speed of the coalition's investigation into the school bus airstrike. That, Mr. Speaker, is too soft. We need a strong, clear, firm condemnation by our government of these attacks.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this debate. I too was deeply troubled by the lack of firm government condemnation. Does he also agree that simply asking the coalition to investigate their own misconduct isn't enough? And does he also understand the concern felt by many of our constituents about our complicity in these actions because of our association with a coalition which has shown callous disregard for human life and human rights and dignity?
I thank my honourable friend, and I concur entirely with everything that he just said. And in terms of independent investigation of these atrocities, time and again in debates on this issue in the House, the point has been made that we need a fully independent, UN-led process that looks at all allegations by all sides, the Saudi-led coalition, the Houthis and others who are in this multifaceted conflict. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman, then my honourable friend.
Callous disregard. Would the honourable gentleman make reference to the fact that the Houthis are launching drone boats against commercial shipping? They're recruiting child soldiers and killing those who won't join the military. And they've sowed 500,000 landmines, posing a mortal danger to innocent civilians. It's important in this debate to get the balance right.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I similarly concur with everything that he has just said. I've already spoken about a number of the Houthi atrocities, the attack on Riyadh that Human Rights Watch had described as almost certainly being a war crime, the siege of Taiz, and in a moment I will come on to the very specific issue that he's rightly drawn the House's attention to, which is the engagement of child soldiers in this conflict by a number of different parties, but particularly, as he rightly says, by the Houthis. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I completely concur with the points he's just made about the indiscriminate attacks by the Houthis, including the rocket attacks, the indiscriminate artillery shelling and many of the other issues. But would he share with me the frustration that we have been repeatedly told by the Saudi Foreign Minister, by the Saudi government, that they would be providing the results of the investigations of the jihad into these attacks, and despite those promises repeatedly over the last 2 years, we have not seen reports into all of those incidents. That's why we need an independent UN investigation.
I thank my honourable friend, and he has done fantastic work on this issue over a long period of time, and I absolutely agree with the comments that he's made, and I think others in the debate may wish to enter that aspect of the discussion. Responding to him now, I'll respond to you. Yes.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman. In opening this debate, he has drawn to a degree an equivalence between the behaviour of the Houthis on the one hand and the coalition on the other. Now, the truth is that we are actually on the side of the coalition, who are unanimously endorsed by the UN Security Council. The coalition is trying to suppress the Houthi rebellion, which is against the legally constituted government of Yemen. And whilst we will rightly have criticisms, serious criticisms, of how the coalition is carrying out its operations, in the end, it is our coalition, endorsed by the United Nations. And it's important they're held to account, but it's important we understand they are trying to do the job of the international community.
Let me make 2 points in response to the honourable gentleman. First of all, international humanitarian law applies whether it's a recognised government committing the alleged violations or a rebel force. And in fact, surely we have a greater responsibility to condemn the actions of, as he describes, our allies if they are acting, as has been widely alleged, in violation of international humanitarian law. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
On that particular point, does he agree with me that it is very unfortunate that we've not had a proper debate and discussion about our involvement in this coalition that apparently now we are part of, as we have just heard, and in particular in arms sales, a great concern that we continue to sell arms to the coalition but don't investigate some of these atrocious issues that he has raised and others have raised too.
I thank my honourable friend, who is a new member to the House, who's already made his mark both on the International Development Committee, which I chair, but also of particular relevance to this on the committees on arms export controls. And I will come in a moment to the issue of our arms sales to members of the coalition, particularly Saudi Arabia. I give way to my friend.
I thank the honourable member for his eloquent speech and actually already making it very balanced about who's to blame. But the biggest cause of concern for me, particularly, is the coalition support of a Saudi-led coalition which has an embargo, basically a siege on Hodeidah port, which is going to mean that millions of civilians will be affected in terms of food and resources, which could lead to the largest famine we've ever seen in the Middle East.
I thank my friend, who is an active member of the International Development Committee, and he anticipates the next part of my speech, so I shall plough on in that light. Of course, of course.
Most grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. We heard that we are supporting the legitimate regime in Yemen. Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that President Hadi's regime was elected on a ballot paper with only one name on it, that his term of office has long since expired, and he spends most of his time either in Riyadh or offshore in an Emirati warship? He's one of the few presidents who has to make a state visit to his own country.
The right honourable gentleman expresses that very, very well indeed, and I pay tribute to his sterling efforts on this issue. And unlike me, he has visited Yemen during the conflict. And I think what is really important, and I'll come back to this in a moment, is that we enable all of the different parties to come together to undertake a peace process. That is surely something all of us can agree on, of course.
Thank him for giving way, but should the answer to the member for Sutton Coldfield have been he is the legitimate government because he is the government recognised by the United Nations Security Council? Were that not the case, it would be quite a different position. Is that not the clear position which is being flouted not only by the Houthis, but very deliberately, and I hope he's going to come on to this, by the theocracy in Tehran?
Clearly, the United Nations Security Council recognises that government. I think the right honourable gentleman has made a very fair point in assessing the level of support that President Hadi actually has now in Yemen. And I think if we are going to get a meaningful peace process for Yemen, that is going to be determined on the streets of Yemen, not in the corridors of New York and votes at the United Nations Security Council. So, no, he is right that the UN Security Council position, as the honourable gentleman referred to previously, is to recognise the Hadi government, but that doesn't contradict the very powerful point that the right honourable gentleman made, which is that the level of popular support for that government in Yemen is at least open to question, to put it very, very mildly. Let me come on now to the position on Hodeidah that was raised. And can I ask the Minister, when he responds, what the British government's view is about the coalition strategy in Hodeidah? And can I ask him to agree with me that in the light of the attempts to restore a peace process, to which I shall return in a moment, in the light of that, the coalition should halt their military offensive in Hodeidah so that peace is given a chance in Yemen? The American Congress has taken a strong line on recent events, and I encourage the British government to reflect on that. Lawmakers in Congress have signed amendments which will provide greater scrutiny over US arms sales, including making it a condition of ongoing US support for the Saudi coalition that the US Secretary of State certify that the coalition are supporting peace talks, improving humanitarian access and reducing the number of innocent casualties. That is the US Congress. And Senator Todd Young, a Republican senator from Indiana, said, and I quote, "The actions of the Saudis in Yemen undercut our, American, national security interests and our moral values, exacerbating the world's largest humanitarian crisis." Can I invite the Minister, when he responds, to agree with Senator Young in that regard? Yes, of course.
On that, would he also share my concern that the head of the Export Control Organisation for Arms Sales here in Britain advised the Minister in 2017 that he thought it would be prudent and cautious to suspend licences, given the gaps in knowledge that the British have in terms of the humanitarian results of use of our weapons. And it is concerning, is it not, that the Minister overturned the official advice and continues to allow sales.
Thank you, and I do concur with that, and I share those concerns, and I hope that perhaps my honourable friend will catch your eye, Mr. Speaker, to elaborate during the debate on that important aspect. I'm pleased to see that the honourable gentleman, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, is with us, because his committee yesterday published an excellent report, Global Britain, the Responsibility to Protect and Humanitarian Intervention. And in that report, the Foreign Affairs Committee recommend government should update its protection of civilians in armed conflict strategy to include a focus on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. As part of that strategy, the committee says, the government should set out the measures it is taking to reduce the impact of these weapons on civilians and on the essential services that civilians rely on, such as healthcare facilities. Can I urge the Minister to respond positively to that recommendation from the Foreign Affairs Committee when the government considers their response, and in particular the central relevance of that recommendation to the situation in Yemen? The sharp increase in the civilian death toll must surely act as a reminder to all of us that this conflict is far from being over. August also saw the release of the United Nations panel of experts on Yemen's report into the conflict. It is a damning report, and it is damning of all sides in this conflict, saying that all of the parties were responsible for a violation of human rights, and examples that they give include rape, torture, disappearances and the deprivation of the right to life. And as the honourable gentleman alluded to earlier on in his intervention, children are being conscripted into this conflict. Children as young as 8 years old, in a clear violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And last year alone, in 2017, 800 children are estimated to have been conscripted into this conflict, mostly, as he rightly said, by the Houthis. The report says that some of these horrendous atrocities could amount to war crimes, and that the international community should, and I quote, refrain from providing arms that could be used in this conflict. Spain has recently cancelled an arms deal with Saudi Arabia over concerns that these weapons are being used in the war in Yemen. There is, as I've already said, a live debate in the United States about American arms sales to the coalition. Can I once again today urge the government to look to suspend arms sales by the UK that could be used in Yemen? I have three. Let me take in the order that I saw this. I'll take my friend.
Honourable Member for giving way. And this is not just a debate that's happening. Would the Honourable Member agree with me? This is not just a debate that's happening in Parliament, but across these islands. There's a YouGov poll this week they released that found that just 1 in 10 of the British public support UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia. 1 in 10. And 1 in 6 people in the UK believe that this promotes British values and interests. This is a dead duck. Nobody believes in it across these islands. In fact, very few. And I'd like to see the Minister say a lot more about this at the end. Thank you.
I thank my friend. I think he expressed the point very well. My right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way in supporting the call that he makes for suspension of arms sales pending an investigation, which is one which the Leader of the Opposition, I see, is in the Chamber, and I, in my previous capacity, jointly made a couple of years ago. Would he not agree that this is a matter of the law? Now, I know there's been a legal case, but the Criterion 2 says, says very clearly that licence should not be granted if there is a clear risk the items might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law. And are not the incidents that happened in August merely further proof that breaches of international humanitarian law are being committed by the coalition?
Can I thank my right honourable friend and pay tribute to him for the role that he has played on this issue over a significant period of time. I absolutely share his view. I know it is one on which there are different views in the House, and we had a fundamental difference of view on this in the committees on arms export controls in the previous Parliament, but I share his view, and I fear that our approach to this as a country undermines our credibility as a force for good in the control of arms around the world. Give way to my
friend for giving way, but in his considerations in coming to that conclusion, does he give any weight to the tens of thousands of aerospace skilled workers, their community, their families, their communities, who depend on the military aircraft, let alone the whole aerospace supply chain, which is vitally important for our industry? Aren't we thinking about them as well?
I thank my honourable friend, and he is of course right to say that one of our considerations in having a policy on the defence industries must of course be about the work for those who are in those industries. But we have not only signed up to a set of laws in our own country, in Europe and internationally on arms control, we have taken the lead on this in international fora. And those laws, those rules, have very little meaning if we're not prepared to enforce them and enforce them consistently, of course.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. We've heard, as he said so graphically, from the different views on different sides on this difficult issue. Does he agree with me that we do operate one of the most robust arms control regimes in the world at the moment? And wouldn't it be sensible to wait for the conclusion of the judicial process in the United Kingdom? The matter is being very carefully considered by the courts, and was in a divisional court last year, who found, after all, on behalf of the government.
Obviously, I'm aware of the court case, and she's right that that process will move forward. I think she's right that, on paper, we have some of the strongest and most robust controls in the world. On paper, we do, but the test, surely, is in the reality of what we do. And we haven't, as a country, been turning down licences for the members of the Saudi-led coalition, unlike other countries. And I think that does raise concern about the practice, as distinct from the theory, of our robust approach to arms control in this country. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
For the honourable gentleman giving way, and for him calling this important debate. When considering our support for the coalition, would he agree that it's very important to understand that the coalition is also fighting against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? And should we not commend the efforts of Emirati troops who have liberated Makalla, which surely is of common security benefit for us all?
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very fair point, and this conflict is multi-faceted. This is not simply two sides. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, of course, has been a security challenge that predates the Yemen conflict that we're talking about today, and there is a further element that I will refer to in a moment, which is the north-south element of this conflict. But of course, all of us, will agree that the defeat of Al-Qaeda is of absolutely crucial importance. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I apologise but isn't this at the heart of the complications of this conflict? In that on some occasions, to our horror, we have found the coalition engaging in battle with the Houthis and supported by the ISIL and Al-Qaeda, the very people who, as my honourable friend quite rightly says, we profoundly oppose.
The right honourable gentleman expresses his point very, very powerfully. Let me move on now. The mandate for the UN panel of experts to continue their work is one of the topics being considered at the UN Human Rights Council meeting, which started this week. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it's of vital importance that the work of this group is able to continue so that it can ensure that all potential violations of international humanitarian or human rights law by any side in this conflict is investigated thoroughly by a neutral panel. There is serious concern that at the Human Rights Council, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates may try to block the extension of the panel of experts' mandate. Can I ask the Minister, when he responds, does the UK government believe that the coalition may well try to do this? And if that is the case, how will the UK work to ensure that this vital body can continue? And in particular, will he confirm to the House today that the UK will give its support to the work of the panel when this issue is debated in Geneva? Also in Geneva, the United Nations Special Envoy was due to hold the first round of consultation talks on peace in Yemen last week. The Houthi delegation failed to turn up, citing claims that they were not guaranteed safe return to Yemen once the talks were finished. Geneva has the potential to be a major step forward for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Martin Griffiths, the United Nations Special Envoy, has said that this latest impasse doesn't mean that the talks are dead, and he is visiting Sana'a to meet Houthi leaders to agree a new timetable for talks. Can I? Of course.
Very much for giving way. Would you like to comment on why he thinks the Houthis didn't turn up to that meeting? Because I think that the demands that they've made show that they weren't actually serious about attending in the first place.
Is anticipating what I was going to say next, but I was in fact going to ask the Minister the question that he's asked me, on the basis that the Minister is probably rather better briefed on these matters than I am. So I'd like to ask the Minister what the government's assessment is of the reasons for the non-attendance of the Houthis, and what the UK will do to help to facilitate their participation so that the talks can get underway as soon as possible. Let me give way to my right honourable friend first.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and can I commend him on his excellent speech. In respect of the peace talks, it's deeply disappointing that they did not proceed. But does he not agree that here is an opportunity for our government to call together the Quint in London in order to keep the peace process going? We simply can't wait for Martin Griffiths. We need to take the initiative, and we need to hold talks here. President Macron managed to do it in Paris. We should be doing this in London.
Thank my right honourable friend, and again pay great tribute to his work, not least with the all-party parliamentary group on Yemen. Again, he slightly anticipated the next part of my speech. I think a meeting of the Quint, as he suggests, would be a very welcome move by the United Kingdom. And of course the UK holds the pen on Yemen in the United Nations Security Council. I think that places a responsibility on us to increase our efforts to bring the parties round the table and to seek a peaceful solution.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. It's my understanding from speaking to contacts in the region that some of the Houthi leadership did in fact want to attend those talks. And isn't it the crucial issue here that we make space for those talks to proceed, that we make space for the work of Martin Griffiths, that we look at other options, as the right honourable gentleman has just suggested, and that the worst thing that could happen at this stage would be an all-out assault on Hodeidah, both in terms of the cost in lives, but also at the potential of undermining the possibility for peace talks.
I absolutely agree with both parts of what my honourable friend has just said, and I think this point illustrates once again the complexity of this. And none of us has any illusions about the Houthis. None of us, I think, has any illusions about Iran and their role that my honourable friend rightly reminded us about. But if we are going to get a peace process going, we're going to have to engage with people, including some pretty unsavoury people, if there is going to be any chance of bringing peace to Yemen. Can I also urge the government to seek an immediate ceasefire so that we can work constructively with the Special Envoy towards peace? Let me now turn to the humanitarian catastrophe in.
Thank you for giving way again. He has, for the first time, I think, in this speech, mentioned the I word, Iran. How are we going to achieve a peace in this situation unless we involve Iran at the beginning and stop the mass export of weapons from Iran to the Houthis?
He is absolutely right to say that Iran needs to be fully engaged in this process. The war is often described as a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I think is actually quite simplistic because it's a far more complicated situation than that. But that is definitely one of the dimensions. We know the damage that has been done by Iranian influence in the Syrian conflict, so no illusions at all about Iran. I've sought to highlight atrocities by the Houthis as well as those by the Saudi-led coalition because I think it's incredibly important to take an accurate and balanced approach to these questions, and those atrocities have contributed to the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe. The statistics are shocking. 22 million people in Yemen are in need of humanitarian and protection assistance, half of them children. Now that's actually 4 million children more than the figure 6 months ago. Actually, when preparing, I checked this because it sounded so dramatic. 4 million more than it was 6 months ago. 11 million children. Famine, denial of access to goods, destruction of medical and education infrastructure, mass outbreaks of both cholera and diphtheria. These are the daily reality of life for the people of Yemen. Petrol, obviously a key commodity, has more than doubled in price. This severely debilitates both transport and healthcare. The transport issue is hugely important. If you can't move the goods and the aid throughout the country, then people will clearly continue to suffer on the edge of starvation. Let me praise the Department for International Development. They have a very positive story to tell when it comes to Yemen. Since the beginning of this conflict, DFID has allocated more than £400 million to help relieve the humanitarian crisis. This has helped over 1 million children and pregnant women get food and medicine. It's supported children through education and reached around 650,000 people in water, sanitation and hygiene programmes. This work, Mr. Speaker, would not be possible without the dedication and skill of those delivering these programmes on the ground. Aid workers put themselves in great personal danger to help the relief of the suffering of some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And it's our duty to ensure that they have the resources they need to carry out their work and surely to do it in as safe an environment as possible. The UN group of experts highlights the lack of proportionality in the use of blockades across Yemen, which have had, as they put it, a widespread and devastating effect on the civilian population. This is further deepening the humanitarian crisis. Civil servants in Yemen haven't been paid for years. The rial, Yemen's national currency, has lost more than half its value. And over recent weeks, citizens have taken to the streets of Aden to protest at the ongoing economic turmoil in their country. The situation could represent a turning point in the south, where instability threatens to spill over and create more conflict between the Hadi government and the southern separatist movements. When this conflict does eventually resolve, there is a huge risk that what will be left behind is a lost generation of young people whose lives have been ravaged by conflict. And I ask the Minister when he responds, when this conflict does end, what will the British government do to support rebuilding in Yemen? The time is surely ripe now for real, meaningful action. The UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, both this month, the UK and other parties have an opportunity to pressure the warring sides to get back around the negotiating table. For too long now, we have seen atrocities in Yemen seemingly without an end in sight. We have an opportunity to act now to prevent further bloodshed, to ensure civilians and humanitarian aid are protected, and to achieve an immediate ceasefire and the resumption of peace talks. Rebuilding Yemen after this conflict will be a huge task, requiring humanitarian assistance, development aid and diplomacy. I urge the Minister today to affirm the UK's long-term commitment to Yemen.
The question is as on the order paper. Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, and I draw the House's attention to my outside interests, which are clearly registered in the House of Commons Register. I congratulate the honourable gentleman on securing this debate. The House, I think, has shown on no less than 3 occasions when you, Mr. Speaker, have granted an emergency debate the deep concern that is felt both in this place, in all parts of the House, about the humanitarian consequences of this dreadful conflict. And the arrival, Mr. Speaker, of a new Foreign Secretary is perhaps a good time to take stock of Britain's position on this matter. Our position affects very much the role we play at the United Nations, and as we've heard, it is an issue that is increasingly of salience in a Britain dominated by the Brexit debate, increasingly of salience, and it is of concern to our constituents. And although I don't expect to carry everyone in the House on my remarks today, I think the one thing that ought to be able to unite everyone here is the importance of moving from conflict to a ceasefire and to negotiations. These conflicts always end, Mr. Speaker, either by outright military victory, where it's fairly clear that that is not going to happen, or through negotiation and through a ceasefire. So I want just to look briefly at the positions of the 3 protagonists in